The eastern wing of the Valkyrie Royal Palace was the last place any servant wanted to work. The other wings were fine. The kitchens were hot but safe. The guest quarters were boring but peaceful. Even the emperor's own hall, with all its ceremony and strict rules, was better than the eastern wing. Because the eastern wing had Reth. Reth was the crown prince's dragon. Dark green scales, each one the size of a human hand. Eyes like 2 yellow moons. A body as large as a draft horse but faster, much, much faster. The kind of fast that meant you did not see it coming until it was already too late. 4 maids had been assigned to the eastern wing in the past 2 months. The first one quit before she even opened the chamber door. She heard Reth move behind it and walked straight back to the staffing office without a word. The second one lasted 3 days before Reth pinned her against the wall with 1 claw and she had to be helped out by 2 footmen. The third one fainted. The fourth one threw her cleaning cart at the dragon and ran. That 4th maid was considered the bravest of the group. So when the staffing officer called Lena into his small office on a gray Tuesday morning and slid a piece of paper across the desk, she looked at the words Eastern Wing, Chamber 1, and understood immediately what she was being asked to do. She picked up the paper and said, "All right." The staffing officer blinked. He had prepared a short speech about hazard pay. Lena was 24 years old. She had brown hair that she kept pulled back, a calm face that did not show much, and hands that were used to hard work. She came from a small town in the north of England, the kind of town where the winters were long and people did not talk much but always meant what they said. She had taken the off-world servant position 6 months ago because the money was 3 times better than anything back home, and her younger brother needed medical treatment that cost more than their family had. She was not brave in the way that people write stories about. She did not want adventure. She was not trying to prove anything. She just needed to do the job. On her first morning, she walked to the eastern wing with her cleaning cart. The hallway leading to Chamber 1 was wide and made of dark stone that echoed every sound. 2 alien footmen stood outside the door. They were tall, with the pale gray skin and sharp jaw markings that most Valkyrie had. When they saw Lena coming, they looked at each other. One of them said, in careful translated English, "You are the new one?" "Yes," Lena said. "The dragon is inside." "I know." The footman looked at her cart, then at her, then back at the door. The last one threw her cart. "I'll try not to do that," Lena said. "It looks expensive." She pushed the door open and went in. The chamber was large. High ceilings. Heavy curtains that kept the morning light out so that everything inside sat in a kind of gray dimness. There was a wide desk near the far window, covered in papers and a few objects she did not recognize. Bookshelves along one wall. A low table. A sitting area with dark furniture. And in the far left corner, on a wide nest of layered fabric and what looked like old military banners, lay Reth. The dragon's eyes were already open. They had been open since the door moved. Lena did not stop walking. She brought her cart to the near side of the room and began with the small table, wiping it down slowly and carefully, moving each object, cleaning beneath it, placing it back exactly where it had been. She did not look directly at Reth. But she was watching. She had learned this from her grandfather, who had kept horses on a small farm outside their town. He had a saying, "You can watch something without staring at it. Your eyes look one way but your mind stays wide open." Animals feel the difference. Staring is a challenge. Watching is just awareness, so she was aware. She knew when Reth lifted his head. She knew when the dragon shifted its weight from one side to the other. She heard the low breath, the quiet sound of scales moving against fabric. Prince Aldrich had not looked up from his desk. He was reading something, turning pages slowly, a cup of something warm near his right hand. He was tall even sitting down. His dark markings ran along his jaw and down the side of his neck. He had not spoken to her or acknowledged her in any way, which was fine. She was not there to be spoken to. She moved to the bookshelf. Dusting. Careful with each shelf. She worked from top to bottom on the left side, then crossed to begin the right. That was when Reth moved. There was almost no sound. One moment the dragon was in the corner. The next moment there was a rush of movement and heat and dark green, and then the bite came down on Lena's left forearm, hard and sudden, the teeth closing through the fabric of her sleeve and into the skin beneath. It hurt. It hurt in a sharp, immediate way that sent a bright line of pain straight up her arm and into her shoulder. Her whole body wanted to pull back. Every nerve she had was telling her the same thing at the same time. Move, pull away, run, get out, go now. She did not move. She stopped. Completely. Like something had pressed a pause button somewhere inside her. Her breath went slow. Her body went still. She did not pull her arm away from the bite. She did not cry out. She did not stumble back. She just stopped. The 2 footmen outside heard something. One of them pressed closer to the door. Prince Aldrich had looked up from his desk. The whole room was waiting for the scream. It did not come. Lena turned her head, slowly and without any sudden movement, and looked at Reth. The dragon's yellow eyes were wide. Its jaw was still closed around her arm. But something in those eyes had shifted the moment she stopped moving. Something had changed in the air of the room, some signal that Lena had sent without meaning to, or maybe with exactly the right meaning. She had not run. She was looking at the dragon the way you look at something you are trying to understand, not something you are afraid of. Her face was steady. Her free hand was open at her side, palm forward, fingers loose. Reth did not release the bite. But the dragon also did not press harder. His breathing had changed. Slower. The chest rising and falling in a different rhythm than it had a moment ago. Lena held the gaze. She had stood like this before. Not with a dragon, with a young stallion on her grandfather's farm, 12 years old and terrified, that had bitten down on the fence rail and would not let go. Her grandfather had told her to stand still and breathe and wait. She had stood there for 6 minutes. The horse had let go on its own. They bite when they're scared, he had told her afterward. Scared things bite harder when you fight them. But if you stop, if you just stop and breathe and stay, sometimes they remember that the world is not ending. She breathed. She stayed. And the world for that moment did not end. Prince Aldrich had not moved from his desk. He was watching the maid and his dragon the way someone watches something they do not have a word for yet. Outside in the hallway, 1 footman had already turned to run for the head chamberlain. Inside the chamber, the only sounds were the slow breath of a dragon and the quiet, steady breathing of a young woman from a small town in the north of England, standing in an alien palace with a dragon's teeth in her arm, not screaming, not running, not doing anything at all except staying exactly where she was. The yellow eyes blinked. Reth held on. Lena waited. The bite held. Reth's jaw did not tighten, but it did not open either. The dragon stood over Lena's arm like something waiting for her to break, to pull, to give it a reason to press harder. That was how it had always worked. Someone would panic, someone would yank away, and the panic would feed into something larger and faster and darker, and the whole thing would end badly. Lena did not panic. She kept her breathing slow and even, the way her grandfather had shown her on that cold morning with the stallion. In through the nose. Out through the mouth. Slow enough that her shoulders dropped. Slow enough that the tension in her arm, the natural pull-away instinct, settled down into something quieter. She could feel the blood. Warm and slow, moving down toward her wrist inside her sleeve. The pain was still there, a hard, steady ache, but pain was something she could put aside. She had broken a finger once on the farm and finished the work before she told anyone. Pain was information. It was not a reason to stop. She looked at Reth. Not a hard stare. Not the kind of look that meant challenge or anger. She softened her eyes the way she used to soften them for nervous animals. Letting the focus go loose, letting her face relax around the eyes so that the expression became something open instead of something sharp. Reth's yellow eyes were fixed on her. The dragon's breathing was fast. Short, tight breaths through the nose. Lena knew that rhythm. It was the rhythm of something frightened. Not aggressive, frightened. There was a difference, and most people never learned it because by the time an animal was showing fear that loudly, most people were already running. She began to lower herself. Slowly. One small movement at a time. She bent her knees and brought herself down, not pulling her arm, just letting her body drop gently toward the floor while her arm stayed in place, following the angle of the dragon's jaw so that nothing jerked or shifted suddenly. She sat down on the cold stone floor. Cross-legged. Below the dragon's eye level now. Below the jaw. Below the chest. She made herself as small and unthreatening as a person could make themselves while still being present. Reth's breathing paused for a moment. Something flickered in those yellow eyes. Not anger. Something more like surprise. Lena kept her free hand open on her knee. Palm up. She had learned that too from years of approaching animals that had been treated badly before she met them. An open hand meant nothing hidden. Nothing coming. Just here I am. That is all. She spoke. Her voice came out low and unhurried, the way voices go when someone is trying not to wake a sleeping child. Easy, she said. I'm not going anywhere. You don't have to hold on so hard. The dragon's ear, a flat, scaled ear that lay close to the skull, moved slightly. Turned toward her voice. I know you're not trying to be cruel, she said. I don't think you're a bad creature. I think you've had a hard time. I think people keep coming in here and being afraid of you, and afraid things are exhausting to be around. I know. I've been around enough of them. She paused. Reth had not moved. But the fast breathing had slowed. Just a little. "I'm not afraid of you," she said. "I probably should be. Everyone tells me I should be. But I grew up around things with big teeth and I learned that the teeth aren't usually the point." Prince Aldrich had not moved from behind his desk. He was standing now. He had risen at some point in the last 2 minutes without realizing it, and he was watching the woman on his floor talk to his dragon in a low and steady voice as if this were a completely ordinary thing to do. He had owned Reth since the dragon was small enough to sit in his arms. He had never heard Reth's breathing slow for a stranger. Lena kept talking. She was not saying anything important. She was talking about the farm. About the way English mornings looked in October, gray and cold with the fields going gold. About her brother, who was 11 and who had taught himself 3 card tricks from a book and practiced them on her every evening. She talked the way water moves, not stopping, not rushing, just going forward. And slowly, the growl that had been sitting low in Reth's chest, that deep, constant vibration like a motor that never fully turned off, began to fade. It did not disappear all at once. It dropped by degrees. A little quieter. A little quieter again. The way a storm moves off over a hill, rumbling less and less until you realize at some point that the sound is gone and you cannot say exactly when it stopped. Lena felt the jaw loosen. She did not move. She let it happen at whatever speed the dragon chose. Reth's grip opened slowly and her arm came free. She brought it into her lap and looked at it without drama. The bite had gone through the fabric. There was blood, a dark stain spreading through the cloth, and beneath it she could feel the deep bruised ache that would make itself known more fully tomorrow. But the wound was not as bad as it could have been. The dragon had not pressed hard at the end. It had let go carefully. She found that interesting. She turned her palm upward and rested her arm on her knee, open and visible, not hiding the wound, not covering it. Just letting it be there, in plain sight, between her and the dragon. Reth stared at the arm. Then the dragon did something that made no sound but seemed to fill the whole room. Reth stepped forward, one slow step then another, and lowered his head. All the way down. Until those yellow eyes were level with Lena's own, and she could feel the warm breath from the dragon's nose moving across her face. She held still. Reth's nose touched her wounded arm. And then the dragon licked it. One long, slow movement of the tongue across the bite wound, and then another. In the Valkyrie world, this meant something that everyone in the palace knew. A dragon's lick was not affection, not in the simple way humans thought of affection. It was an admission. It was the dragon's way of saying, "I caused this. I'm sorry for this. I am telling you with my body because I have no other language." It was submission. It was an apology. Reth had given this gesture exactly once in his life, 3 years ago, to Prince Aldrich, after a moment that Aldrich had never spoken about to anyone. And now the dragon was giving it to a human woman who had been in the palace for less than a day. Prince Aldrich stood behind his desk with both hands flat on the surface and said absolutely nothing. He was not a person who was easily surprised. He had been raised inside one of the most powerful ruling families in the known empire. He had sat in rooms where decisions were made that changed the lives of millions of people. He had learned from a young age to keep his face still and his reactions private. But right now his face was not still. His face was doing something he could not control, which was the expression of a person who has just seen something that does not fit inside any category they were ever given. Reth pulled back slowly and sat down next to Lena. Not across the room. Not in his corner. Right next to her, close enough that his shoulder would have touched hers if he had been smaller. He settled his weight down onto the stone floor with a low sound, folded his front legs and rested. Like he was simply done. Like this was where he intended to be now. Lena looked at the dragon beside her. Then she looked at the blood on her arm. Then she looked up at Prince Aldrich across the room. She said in a perfectly calm voice, "Do you have a cloth I could borrow? And possibly something to wrap this with?" Aldrich stared at her for a moment longer. Then he opened his desk drawer and took out a clean folded cloth without saying a word and walked it across the room and held it out to her. She took it, pressed it to her arm, nodded once in thanks. Outside the door, one of the footmen had already gone running. The head chamberlain was on his way. In a few minutes the hallway would be full of people trying to understand what had just happened inside chamber 1 of the eastern wing. But for now the room was quiet. A dragon sat beside a human woman on the cold stone floor. And a prince stood nearby, holding nothing, saying nothing, understanding for the first time that there were things in the world he had not been taught. By the next morning, the story had already changed 3 times. The first version, which spread through the servant quarters before breakfast, was mostly true. A human maid had been bitten by Reth. She had not run. The dragon had submitted to her. Prince Aldrich had given her a cloth for her wound. The second version, which reached the kitchen staff by mid-morning, said that Lena had stared the dragon down with some kind of special human ability. That her eyes had done something unusual. That Reth had cowered. The third version, which arrived in the noble dining hall by lunch, said that the human woman had whispered a command into the dragon's ear and that Reth had rolled onto his back like a dog. None of the nobles believed any version of it. Lord Gavrin, who sat at the head of the secondary dining table and had opinions about everything, set down his cup and said that it was servant gossip and nothing more. That Reth was a bonded dragon of royal blood, and the idea that a human cleaning woman had done something that 4 years of Valkyrie animal specialists had failed to do was simply not worth discussing. The table agreed with him. Then the footman who had been standing outside chamber 1 that morning walked past the dining hall doorway, and 3 different people stopped him to ask what he had actually seen. He told them. The table went quiet. Lord Gavrin picked his cup back up and said nothing for the rest of the meal. Lena did not know about any of this. She reported for her shift in the Eastern Wing the same as she would have reported for any other shift. On time, with her cart, with her hair pulled back and her sleeve rolled down over the bandage on her forearm. The palace physician had cleaned and wrapped the wound the previous evening. It ached. She had slept fine anyway. The 2 footmen outside chamber 1 watched her come down the hall. One of them opened the door for her without being asked, which had not happened for any of the previous maids. She nodded at them and went in. Reth was already awake. The dragon lifted his head when the door opened and watched her bring the cart inside. Then he stood up, stretched in the long slow way that large animals stretch, front legs forward, back arching, and walked across the room to her. He stopped beside her cart and sat down. Lena looked at him. "You're going to be in the way," she said. Reth looked back at her with his yellow eyes and did not move. "All right," she said and worked around him. Prince Aldrich came in an hour later. He stopped just inside the doorway when he saw where Reth was sitting, directly beside the human maid, watching her clean the bookshelf with an expression that could only be described as content. Aldrich sat at his desk. He opened his papers. He did not read them. He began watching her without meaning to. It started with small things. The way she approached each part of the room before she touched it, pausing just slightly, reading the space, adjusting the way she would move through it. She never bumped into anything. She never knocked anything over. She moved through the chamber the way water moves through a space, finding the natural path without forcing one. She always knew where Reth was. Not because she kept looking at the dragon directly, but because her body was always slightly oriented toward him, aware of his position the way a person is aware of a fire in a room. Not staring at it, just knowing it is there. And Reth, who had spent 4 years making every person in the room acutely aware of his position in the worst possible way, seemed to find this comfortable. He would shift. She would adjust. No drama. No tension. Just 2 creatures sharing a space without fighting over it. Aldrich found himself reading the same paragraph 4 times. He put the paper down. Over the following 3 days he continued to watch, and the more he watched the more he noticed. Lena never moved fast inside the chamber. Not because she was slow, she covered a lot of ground in her shifts, but because every movement had a kind of intention behind it. Nothing was careless. Nothing was accidental. She also never looked like she was performing for anyone. Most servants, when they became aware that the prince was watching them, changed slightly. Back straightened. Movements became more deliberate. There was a subtle shift in energy that Aldrich had learned to recognize years ago. Lena did not change at all. Either she did not notice he was watching or she did not care. He could not decide which one it was, and he found that he could not stop thinking about it. On the 4th day he called her to his desk. She came and stood in front of it without fidgeting. Her hands were at her sides. Her bandaged arm had a fresh wrapping, white against the dark fabric of her uniform sleeve. She looked at him the same way she had looked at Reth on the first day. Calm. Present. Not afraid. He had spoken to many people in his life. Advisors, diplomats, military officers, scholars. People who had spent years learning how to stand in front of him correctly. None of them had ever made him feel quite as directly looked at as this woman did. He said, "I want to ask you something." "All right," she said. "Why did you not run?" She did not answer immediately. She thought about it, which he appreciated. He had spent enough time around people who answered before they had actually considered the question. Then she said, "Running makes you pray." He waited to see if there was more. "When something dangerous looks at you," she continued, "and you run, you've just answered a question for it. You've told it that you're the kind of thing that runs. And things that run get chased. It's not a decision the predator makes. It's just what follows. Aldrich looked at her. And if you stay? Then you haven't answered the question yet, she said. And the predator has to wait and see. And sometimes while it's waiting, something changes. He was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the violet sky of the Valkyrie homeworld had turned a deeper shade as the afternoon moved on. Somewhere in the room behind Lena, Reth made a low sound, not a growl. Something more like a sigh. Where did you learn this? Aldrich asked. My grandfather's farm, she said. Northern England. He kept horses and my uncle had cattle. I grew up around large animals. You learn quickly what works and what doesn't. There are no dangerous animals on your world anymore, he said. I have read this. Your species removed most of them. We did, she said. But the knowledge didn't leave with them. It stays in people. In the way we react. In what our bodies remember even when our minds have forgotten why. Aldrich looked at the bandage on her arm. You were hurt. Yes. And you still stayed. The hurt was already done, she said simply. Running after that wouldn't have fixed the arm. It would have just made everything worse. He had no answer for that. He was not sure what he had expected her to say, but it was not that, and the plainness of it sat in the room with a weight he could not quite measure. He nodded once and said, Thank you. You can continue. She went back to her cart. What Aldrich did not know was that the conversation had been partially overheard. A junior footman stationed in the outer hall had heard Lena's voice through the not quite closed door, and that evening he told the story to 2 other servants, and by the following morning the words had traveled in the way words always travel in a palace, quietly and completely everywhere at once. Running makes you pray. People repeated it in different ways. Some of them laughed. Some of them went quiet afterward in a way that meant they were thinking about it and did not want to show it. In the noble quarters, Lord Gavrin heard the words secondhand from his personal attendant and dismissed them as the kind of simple animal logic that impressed people who did not know better. But that night, alone in his study, he wrote the phrase down on a small piece of paper. He was not sure why. He told himself it was for documentation purposes. He folded the paper and put it in his desk drawer and did not take it out again, but he also did not throw it away. In Chamber 1, Reth slept through the night for the first time in 4 years. Nobody noticed that yet. But they would. The letter arrived on a gray morning, 6 days after the bite. It was printed on heavy paper with the imperial seal pressed into the top, a dark wax stamp that most people in the palace went their entire careers without ever receiving. The head chamberlain delivered it personally to the Eastern Wing staff quarters and slid it under Lena's door before she was awake. She found it when she got up. She read it once. Then she read it again. It informed her, in very formal language, that she was required to appear before the imperial court of the Valkyrie Empire in 3 days' time to answer questions regarding her interference with the sacred dragon bond of Crown Prince Aldrich. Attendance was not optional. Representation would not be provided. She was to come alone and stand before the court and give an account of herself. She set the letter on her small bedside table and went to wash her face. Then she sat on the edge of her bed for a moment and looked out the narrow window at the pale morning sky and thought about her brother back home, who would be getting up for school right now, probably arguing with their mother about breakfast. She breathed in. She breathed out. Then she got up and went to work. The 3 days passed quickly. Reth continued to follow her. This was the part that had caused the most trouble, she understood. Not the bite itself, not the submission, but the following. A bonded dragon staying close to someone other than its bonded person was the thing that had finally pushed the court into action. It was the visible sign that something had shifted, and visible signs in a royal palace were impossible to ignore for long. Aldrich had not spoken to her again after their conversation at his desk. But she noticed that he watched Reth more carefully now. Not with anger. With something more complicated than anger, something that looked like a person trying to solve a problem they did not fully understand yet. She did not try to fix it. It was not her problem to fix. She came in, she cleaned, she worked, and when Reth settled beside her she let him settle and worked around him the same as always. On the morning of the 3rd day she put on her cleanest uniform, wrapped her arm in a fresh bandage, and walked to the imperial court. She had never been in that part of the palace before. The court chamber was enormous. It had the kind of size that felt intentional, designed to make whoever stood at the center of it feel as small as possible. The ceiling was so high it was almost lost in shadow. The walls were dark stone carved with the histories of the Valkyrie Empire going back thousands of years. The seats rose in curved tiers on both sides, and every single one of them was filled. 400 people at least. All alien. All watching. Lena walked to the center of the stone floor and stopped. She stood with her hands at her sides and looked at the room without letting the size of it change her breathing. She had spent 3 days thinking about this moment, and she had decided one thing clearly: she was going to tell the truth in plain words and not dress it up and not apologize for it. That was all she could do. So that was what she would do. The 3 judges sat on a high curved platform directly in front of her. The one in the center, Lord Gavrin, she would later learn his name, was older, with deep markings along his face and pale eyes that moved over her the way eyes move over something being assessed. At the far end of the chamber, elevated above everyone else, sat the Emperor on a chair of dark stone. He was still and quiet. She could not read his expression from this distance. To the Emperor's right sat Prince Aldrich. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the surface of the platform in front of him with his jaw set and his hands folded. Lord Gavrin spoke. His voice was practiced and flat and filled the chamber without effort. He explained the charge. Interference with a sacred dragon bond. An act that had no precedent in the recorded history of the Empire. The bond creature Reth had demonstrated divided loyalty, had followed, guarded, and submitted to a human servant. The court wished to understand how this had occurred and whether forbidden methods had been used. Then he looked down at Lena. You will explain yourself, he said. Lena took one breath. I didn't do anything to the dragon, she said. Her voice came out clear and steady in the large room. He bit me. I stayed still. I sat down so he wouldn't feel threatened by my height. I spoke to him in a calm voice. He calmed down. That is everything that happened. Murmurs moved through the tiered seats like wind through grass. Gavrin waited for the sound to settle. You expect this court to believe that no special technique was used. No chemical substance. No knowledge obtained through unauthorized study of Velcari animal handling methods. I expect the court to believe what happened, Lena said. I didn't use any of those things. I used the same instincts I would have used with any large frightened animal back home. Back home, Gavrin repeated slowly as if the words had a taste he was not sure about. You mean Earth? Yes. One of the other judges leaned forward. He was younger than Gavrin, with sharper markings and a voice that had an edge to it. We have brought 3 specialists to speak today. All 3 of them have studied dragon bonding for decades. All 3 of them will tell this court that what you are describing is neurologically impossible. A bonded dragon cannot form a secondary attachment that overrides the primary bond. It cannot choose a stranger over its bonded person. The biology does not allow it. I can only tell you what I saw, Lena said. I'm not a dragon specialist. I don't know the biology. I know what happened in that room. Then explain, the younger judge said, why the dragon follows you. Lena thought about this for a moment. I think, she said carefully, that Reth was frightened. Not just that day, for a long time before that day. And frightened creatures push people away because pushing people away is the only control they have. Every person who came into that room ran from him, and that confirmed what he already believed, that he was something to be feared, something that could not be approached. When I didn't run, I gave him something different. I gave him a moment where his fear didn't win. And I think that mattered to him. The chamber was quiet. Not the polite quiet of people waiting for something to end. The real quiet of people who have heard something and need a moment before they can respond to it. Gavrin studied her from his high platform. His pale eyes had not moved from her face since she began speaking. You are saying that you understood the creature's emotional state. Yes. You are a cleaning servant. Yes. And you understood the emotional state of one of the most complex bonded creatures in the Empire. I understood a frightened animal, Lena said. The species was different. The feeling wasn't. More murmurs. Louder this time. The youngest of the 3 judges, who had not spoken yet, leaned forward now. He looked at her with something that was not hostility. It was closer to genuine curiosity. Are all humans capable of this? He asked. The chamber went very still. Lena looked at him. She thought about her grandfather, who could walk into a field of nervous horses and have them settled in 10 minutes. She thought about her mother, who could tell from the sound of a neighbor's voice through a closed door whether they were having a good day or a bad one. She thought about the people she had grown up with, ordinary people, farmers and teachers and shopkeepers, and the quiet ways they read the world around them without ever calling it a skill. The ones who survived, she said quietly. Yes. Nobody spoke. The sound of 400 people breathing was the only thing in the room. Then, from the right side of the Emperor's platform, there was movement. Prince Aldrich stood up. Every head turned. This was not part of the proceeding. Witnesses did not stand without being called. Members of the royal family certainly did not stand during a servant's trial without prior arrangement. The protocol of the moment was being broken openly and everyone in the chamber knew it. Aldrich's voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it, something that had not been there 2 weeks ago. "I will speak in defense of the Maid," he said. The chamber erupted. Voices from every tier, overlapping and loud, filling the great stone room with the sound of 400 opinions arriving at once. The judges looked at each other. The junior clerks at the side tables stopped writing. Lord Gavrin raised his hand for quiet, and the room took almost a full minute to obey. The Emperor had not moved. He was watching his son with an expression that Lena, even from the center of the floor, could see had changed. Gavrin called for a recess in a voice that suggested he needed one himself. And Lena stood alone on the cold stone floor at the center of the most powerful room in the Empire, with her bandaged arm and her plain uniform, and waited to see what would happen next. The recess was supposed to last 20 minutes. It lasted nearly 2 hours. Lena was taken to a small waiting room off the side of the main chamber. It had one narrow window, 2 plain chairs, and a low table with a cup of water on it that someone had placed there and then apparently forgotten about. A single guard stood outside the closed door. She could hear voices in the corridor, urgent, overlapping, the sound of people trying to solve something quickly. She sat in one of the chairs and drank the water and waited. She was not afraid. She had expected the trial to go badly in some formal technical sense. She had not done anything wrong and she knew it, but knowing you are right and being believed are two different things, and she had lived long enough to understand that difference clearly. What she had not expected was Aldrich standing up. She thought about that. About the look on his face when he rose from his seat. About the way the chamber had reacted, not just surprised but genuinely shaken, the way people are shaken when something happens that breaks a rule they forgot was only a rule and not a law of nature. She was still thinking about it when the door opened. It was not a guard. It was a small, quiet official in a gray robe who told her, in careful translated English, that she was being summoned. Not back to the main chamber. Somewhere else. She followed him through corridors she had never seen before. Narrower than the main halls, plainer, the kind of corridors that existed for moving between important places without being seen. They walked for several minutes and stopped in front of a door that looked ordinary except for the 2 Imperial guards standing on either side of it. The official knocked once. A voice from inside said something in Valkyrie. The official opened the door and gestured for Lena to go in. She went in. The room was small and plain. This surprised her. She had expected something grand, high ceilings, carved stone, the visual weight of power arranged around every surface. But this room was just a room. A window. A few shelves with books and objects on them. A low fire burning in a simple grate. 2 chairs angled toward each other near the window, the kind of arrangement that meant conversation rather than ceremony. The Emperor was already there. He was standing by the window with his back to her when she entered. He turned when he heard the door. Up close he looked older than he did on the throne, not weaker, just more real. The ceremonial markings on his face were the same deep color as Aldrich's but more faded with age. His eyes were steady and dark and they moved over her once, quickly and completely, the way experienced people take in information. There were no guards inside the room. She noticed this immediately. He noticed her noticing. "I sent them out," he said. His translated English was better than most, cleaner, with less of the mechanical flatness that translation usually carried. "Sit down." She sat. He sat across from her. For a moment he simply looked at her in the way that people look when they are deciding where to begin something they have been thinking about for longer than the current conversation. Then he said, "My son has not defended anyone in that chamber in 11 years. Lena said nothing. She waited. "He was 12 when he last did it," the Emperor continued. He stood up for a young stable worker who had been wrongly accused of damaging royal property. Everyone in the room told him afterward that it was inappropriate. That princes do not intervene in servant matters. That it made him look weak. He paused. He listened to them. He did not do it again. Until today. He let that sit in the room for a moment. "I want to talk to you about Reth," he said. Lena nodded. "For years ago," he said, "Reth had a handler. A woman named Vel. She had worked with him since he was very young. She understood him in the way that you apparently understand animals, through patience and presence rather than training and commands." He stopped. "She was killed in an accident. A transport failure in the outer city. She was gone very quickly and Reth had no warning and no time to adjust." He looked at the fire in the grate. "After that, Reth changed. The aggression began slowly and then became worse every month. We brought in 6 specialists over 2 years. Animal behaviorists, bond therapists, 2 researchers from the Northern University who had spent their careers studying dragon psychology. All of them said the same thing. That the bond with Aldrich was the only stable point left in the dragon's mind and that everything around that bond had become fear and anger. That nothing could be done except to maintain the existing bond and keep strangers away. He looked back at her. We kept strangers away, he said. And Reth got worse anyway. Slowly. Every season a little worse than the last. The specialist said this was expected. That a damaged bond creature deteriorates over time. That we should prepare ourselves for the eventual outcome. Lena understood what eventual outcome meant without him saying it. And then you walked into that room, he said. And in one morning you did something that 6 specialists and 4 years of careful management could not do. The fire made a small sound. Outside the window the Valkyrie sky had moved into the deep blue of late afternoon. Tell me how, he said. Not the version you gave the court. The real one. Take whatever time you need. So Lena told him. She started with her grandfather, which was where it always started. The farm in the north of England. The smell of cold mornings and hay and the particular sound a nervous horse makes when it is trying to decide whether you are safe or not. She told him about standing in the field at age 9 with the stallion that had thrown 2 grown men, and how her grandfather had not given her instructions. He had just stood beside her and breathed slowly until she matched his breathing without thinking about it. He told me that calm is something you can give, she said. Like warmth. If you are genuinely calm, not pretending, not pushing the fear down but actually settled in yourself, something near you can feel it. Animals feel it faster than people do. They don't have the part of the brain that argues with what they sense. They just receive it directly. The Emperor was listening the way careful people listen, without interrupting, without nodding too much, just holding the space open for the words to fill. On Earth, she continued, humans lived beside dangerous things for a very long time. Not behind walls or shields. In the open. In the same fields and forests and riverbanks as things that were faster and stronger and had better teeth than us. We survived that not because we overpowered those things but because we learned to read them. We learned what their bodies were saying before their bodies moved. We learned the difference between an animal that is hunting and an animal that is frightened. Because those two things look almost the same from a distance and you have to be close and still and paying real attention to see the difference. She paused. Reth was frightened, she said. Not dangerous. Frightened. And frightened things don't need to be corrected or managed or kept away from people. They need someone to stay. The Emperor was quiet for a long moment. The fire had burned lower. The room was dimmer than when she had come in. We classified your people as servant class, he said finally, because your technology was behind ours when contact was made. Because your ships were slower and your weapons were smaller and your cities were less advanced. We looked at what you had built and we made a judgment about what you were. He stopped. We did not look at what you had survived, he said, or what that surviving had made you. He sat back in his chair. We have made a mistake with your people, he said quietly. The words were simple and plain and he said them the way people say things they have thought about carefully and decided to mean completely. Lena looked at him. What happens now? She asked. He opened his mouth to answer. A sound came from the doorway. They both turned. Prince Aldrich stood in the open door. He had clearly come quietly, or perhaps he had simply been standing there for a while. His expression was the expression of someone who has heard something that has rearranged something inside them and has not yet decided what to do about it. His eyes moved from the Emperor to Lena. The Emperor looked at his son for a long moment. Then he looked back at Lena and said in a voice that was quiet but certain, Now we do something different. The official letter came 4 days after the private meeting. It was different from the first letter, the trial summons that had arrived on heavy paper with a cold formal tone. This one was shorter. Plainer. It stated simply that Lena of the Eastern Wing staff was being reassigned to a new position, effective immediately. The title was listed as primary handler of the bond creature Reth, with an additional informal role as advisory attendant to Crown Prince Aldrich. The pay was 4 times what she had been earning as a maid. She read the letter twice, folded it carefully, and put it in the small wooden box she kept under her bed where she stored things that mattered. Then she wrote a short message home to her mother and her brother saying that things were going well and that the medical payments would not be a problem anymore. She did not mention the dragon or the trial or the Emperor. Some things were too large to explain in a short message and she had always believed it was better to say a small true thing than a large complicated one. The court did not take the reassignment quietly. Lord Gavrin sent a formal letter of objection to the Emperor's office within hours of the announcement. 2 other noble houses followed by the end of the day. A senior military advisor requested a private audience to express his concerns about the precedent being set. One of the alien journalists who wrote for the main imperial news publication wrote a long piece about the erosion of sacred traditions and what it meant for the future of the empire. The emperor read all of it. He sent polite acknowledgments to each one. He changed nothing. Lena moved her things from the servant quarters to a small room closer to the eastern wing. It was still a plain room. She had not asked for anything grand and nothing grand had been offered, but it had a larger window and better light and she could hear the distant sound of the palace gardens from her bed in the morning, which she liked. She began her work with Reth the same way she had done everything else, quietly, consistently, without drama. She came at the same time every morning. She left at the same time every evening. She did not change the routine once she had set it because she understood that routine was itself a form of safety for a frightened creature. Predictability meant the world was not going to suddenly become something different. And a world that stayed the same was a world that could be trusted. Reth watched her for the first week the way he had always watched strangers, with those wide yellow eyes tracking every movement, every shift of weight, every small sound. But she was not a stranger anymore and some part of him already knew it, and by the second week the watching had changed from assessment to something more like habit. The way you watch something familiar not because you are checking it but simply because it is there and you are used to it being there. By the third week he slept when she was in the room. Not the shallow, twitching half-sleep of an anxious animal. Real sleep. Deep and slow, with his great head resting on his folded front legs and his breathing long and even. The palace physician who had been monitoring Reth for 4 years came to observe and stood in the doorway of Chamber 1 for 10 minutes watching the dragon sleep and then went away and wrote something in his notes that he later described to a colleague as the most surprising thing he had recorded in 30 years of practice. The aggression did not disappear all at once. There were still bad days. Days when something in Reth's mood was dark and tight and Lena could feel it the moment she walked in. A heaviness in the air of the room, a tension in the dragon's shoulders that meant today was not a good day. On those days she adjusted. She worked more quietly. She stayed lower. She gave him more space and asked for less. She did not push. She had learned from her grandfather that healing was not a straight line. It went forward and then sideways and sometimes briefly backward, and the worst thing you could do was treat the backward days as failures. They were just days. You came back the next morning and you started again. She came back every morning and started again. Aldrich started appearing in the chamber at different times than he used to. Before he had kept to a strict schedule, mornings at his desk, afternoons in council, evenings in his private study. The chamber had been a place he worked in, not a place he stayed in. But now he began arriving earlier and leaving later, and sometimes in the middle of the afternoon he would simply sit near the window and read, not at his desk but in one of the low chairs closer to where Reth rested. Closer to where Lena worked. He did not always speak. Sometimes he just existed in the same space which she found she did not mind. He had the same quality she had noticed in the very first days, a stillness underneath the formality, a quietness that was not emptiness but something more like patience waiting to be used correctly. He started asking questions. Not the testing questions he had asked in the early days, the ones that had an answer already built into them that he was checking her against. Real questions. Open ones. The kind that meant he genuinely did not know and wanted to. He asked about Earth. About what it looked like. About the animals and the weather and the way people lived. She told him about rain, which the Valkyrie homeworld almost never had, and he listened with the focused attention of someone hearing about something completely foreign and finding it more interesting than he expected. He asked about her family. She told him about her brother and the card tricks. He was quiet for a moment after that and then said, in a voice that was less formal than his usual one, that he had not spoken to anyone about something small and ordinary in a very long time. She said, "Small and ordinary things are usually the most important ones." He thought about that for the rest of the day. She could tell because his expression had the particular quality of a person carrying a thought carefully, the way you carry something full that you do not want to spill. The council noticed the change in him before he did. He listened more in meetings. He stopped finishing other people's sentences before they had finished thinking. He began asking his senior advisors what they actually believed rather than accepting the first polished answer they offered. One of the oldest advisors, a woman who had served 3 generations of the imperial family, told a colleague privately that the prince had become someone she recognized again. Someone she had not seen since he was a boy. She did not know what had changed. She was glad of it regardless. 6 months after the letter, the emperor stood before the full imperial court. The chamber was as full as it had been on the day of the trial. The same tiered seats, the same curved platform, the same high ceiling disappearing into shadow. But the feeling in the room was different. Trials had one kind of energy. This had another. The emperor spoke for 12 minutes. His voice was steady and unhurried, and he did not read from a prepared text. He spoke about the history of first contact with human civilization. About the judgments that had been made in those early years based on technology and infrastructure and the visible markers of advancement. About what those judgments had missed. He announced that humans within the Empire were no longer classified as servant class. They were recognized as a protected people with the right to fair wages, the right to refuse unsafe working conditions, the right to bring complaints before the imperial court directly, and the right to representation in formal proceedings. It was not everything. It was a beginning. He said this himself, clearly, so that no one could later claim the declaration was presented as more than it was. There was more work to do. This was the first step of that work. The chamber was not entirely pleased. Lena, standing along the eastern wall with the other staff, could see the stiff shoulders and tight expressions in certain sections of the tiered seats. Change of this kind never arrived without resistance. She had not expected it to. But she also heard something else moving through the room, quieter, less visible, but real. Something that had been loosened. A thing that had been held tight for a long time, beginning very slowly to open. After the announcement, when the chamber had filled with movement and voices and the organized chaos of a major proceeding ending, Aldrich found her by the eastern wall. He stood beside her and looked out at the room. He did not say anything grand. He was still learning that the grandest things rarely needed grand words. "You should have been seated at the front," he said. "I could see fine from where I was," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "That is exactly the problem with you." "What is?" "You never ask for what you have earned." She looked at him. "I asked for what I needed. That's usually enough." He had no answer for that. He was getting used to not having answers for the things she said. He had decided some time ago that this was not a bad thing, that a person who left you without answers was more valuable than one who left you with easy ones. Reth padded through the crowd quietly and pressed his great head against Lena's shoulder. She reached up without looking and rested her hand along his jaw, the way she did every morning when she arrived and every evening when she left. The palace hall was full of noise all around them. But in that small space, the prince, the maid, and the dragon, there was something steady and calm and real that had not been there before. The palace had fallen silent the day the dragon bit her. Now it was filled with something it had not held in a very long time. Perhaps something it had never held quite like this before. Respect.